This is episode 149 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am pleased to be joined this week by Zach Fort. He is the president of the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Zach.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and for listeners out there, we are now on our 149th episode, and astute observers will note that this is the first episode in which we're talking about guns and the Second Amendment. It's an area that the Rio Grande Foundation is going to engage with a little bit more, especially with the increasing number of attacks on Second Amendment and gun rights at the state and local level. We certainly let the big boys in Washington at the NRA and other organizations focus on the Second Amendment in Congress and those kinds of very specific constitutional issues. But we're going to be working on this issue because it's coming under attack more and more often at the state and local level. So, Zach, before we get into everything else, tell us a little bit about your interest in this issue, how long you've been involved in the Shooting Sports Association, and kind of a little bit about that organization.
Yeah, so like you said, my name is Zach Fort. I'm the president of New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. I became president of NMSSA back in May of 2018, and I was kind of involved in the board of the organization a little bit before that. So my involvement with NMSSA is basically to kind of take this organization and to retool and to recalibrate it into an organization that was mostly focused on protecting and defending our right to keep and bear arms in New Mexico. Because in New Mexico, we have a right to keep and bear arms not only under the federal constitution of the Second Amendment, there is a provision in the state constitution that guarantees our individual right to keep and bear arms. So over the past several years, like you said, the Second Amendment and individual liberties have becoming increasingly under attack in New Mexico. So that was kind of the problem that I saw in the state. And so I decided to jump in and to kind of retool this organization and guide it to be an organization that's focused on this and can deliver results for New Mexicans for their rights.
So for all the talk about the NRA being a very powerful organization and just having oodles of resources, you're a volunteer.
Yes.
How did you come to be a volunteer in this organization? Is it just pure personal interest? Do you have some silver tongue that you can go up and talk to legislators in Santa Fe? How'd that process work out?
Definitely. There's no silver tongue involved in this kind of stuff. I'd been involved in some political campaigns before, but this is an issue that matters to me. One of many issues that matters to me. But this is an issue where I saw it's like, if they can just eliminate an amendment to the Constitution without repealing it, then what's that going to do to individual liberty in this country and things? Because if you can set a precedent for effectively stripping out an amendment to the Constitution without repealing it, then the Constitution is just a piece of paper that doesn't have true backing. There's so many other issues in terms of limited government that also tie into Second Amendment issues when you look at it through a more holistic view.
No doubt about it. And the Rio Grande Foundation, just to be clear, has always supported the Second Amendment, but we're a small organization, limited resources, and many of those issues traditionally have been fought in Washington, D.C., far away from our sphere of influence. Nowadays, those fights are increasingly coming to us here at the state and local levels. But Grover Norquist, who's been on this show, Americans for Tax Reform, he has a coalition that he calls the Leave Us Alone Coalition, also the Center-Right Coalition, and he definitely puts gun owners in that group of people who don't want anything from government. They just want to be left alone and able to use and enjoy their guns, whether for protection or for fun, without the government trying to micromanage that. And would you say that's, broadly speaking, what the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association is all about, or what? How do you have a relationship with national gun groups like the NRA?
So we are the state affiliate of the NRA, so we definitely we support their efforts. However, you know what? We're mostly focused on the state and local level, and I'm glad you actually brought up Grover Norquist. I believe he's an NRA board member. He may not be a current NRA board member.
He has been.
I know he at least has been. I can't testify if he currently is one. But yeah, so this is if they would just leave our rights alone and we could just go have fun at the range, that would be great. I would love that. I mean, there would be no reason for me to be involved in this organization. However, there has been, you see different shifts in society where people want to have more government. They see a problem. They think that the answer to the problem is more government. So that's what we're seeing that more and more in New Mexico. And this is not only on Second Amendment related issues, but as I'm sure all your listeners are well aware, there's a lot of gridlock in Washington across the spectrum of issues. So what we've seen is a lot of stuff go down and fought at the state and local level. That's where a lot of the stuff is happening on guns, where, Oklahoma just passed constitutional carry, where you can carry a concealed firearm without a permit. And at the same time, California just passed 15 new gun control measures. So a lot of stuff is right now happening at the state level.
So tell me a little bit about, and the listeners, of course, about, the 50,000 foot overview of gun rights in New Mexico, because my understanding, and not get too much into the politics, but traditionally, as I've seen it, gun rights have been a pretty nonpartisan issue politically in New Mexico. Bill Richardson was endorsed by the NRA, I think both campaigns. Just how has this issue developed? Because it's now suddenly a very partisan, or at least ideological issue, with what I describe as the progressives having largely taken over the Democratic Party. Not all of it, but largely, and they are much different on guns than traditional Democrats are. So kind of work us through a little bit of that history. I know it's going to have to happen much quicker than the reality. It took a long time for these issues to come to a head like they have.
Yeah, definitely. So I would actually say, to a degree, much more so than other states, the Second Amendment support for the Second Amendment is still a nonpartisan issue in New Mexico. See, because a lot of the traditional rural Democrats, they still support Second Amendment rights. So yeah, as you were talking about, Bill Richardson had good ratings from the NRA, as has many other Democrats in the state of Mexico. And actually, many Democrats still have good ratings from the NRA. So in the rural parts of the state, if you go out to Espanola, if you go out to Gallup, Silver City, Deming, even areas like that are very heavily Democrat, those areas still strongly support Second Amendment rights. It's mostly in the metropolitan areas, or the more metropolitan areas, I should say, of Las Cruces, Albuquerque, and Santa Fe that have seen an influx, whether it be from people moving here or just people taking a greater interest in this California, New York style progressivism, where they take a much harder stance against firearms. So it's mostly been in those kind of those progressive ecosystems in Las Cruces, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, where you see the people who are taking a stand against the Second Amendment.
Would you say that this is kind of a broadening, or just one of the many fronts on the battle between New Mexico being a rural versus an urban state? Is this kind of the front lines of that battle?
Definitely, this is absolutely one of the front lines, and if we can get into it a little bit, if you'd like, there had the kind of Second Amendment sanctuary county movement, and it was a lot about guns, but at the same time, there were a lot of people across rural New Mexico who felt like people from Santa Fe and Albuquerque were not interested in hearing their concerns. We're talking that there are a lot of these political groups that are popping up, like Save Our Western Way of Life, and that's one of their key issues is Second Amendment gun rights and Second Amendment rights. This is in a lot of ways one of the first hills of this battle between the metropolitan interests versus the rural interests in this state.
We're going to leave it right there and bring in Alexandra Garza for a quick conversation. She lobbies on some issues on behalf of the NRA and presumably your organization, the Shooting Sports Association in Santa Fe, but she is based in Colorado. And so we're going to have her on momentarily to talk about issues with guns in New Mexico. Pleased to be joined with Alexandra Garza. She is a lobbyist in New Mexico's legislature and a handful of other legislatures around the western United States for the National Rifle Association. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Alexandra.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys having me on.
Yeah, and thanks for being here, and thanks for all that you do for gun rights in our state. Now, Alexandra, how long have you been involved in the NRA and these gun issues?
So I've been a contract lobbyist for about a decade now, with the NRA specifically since last November, so about a year now.
Okay, and you've seen, at least in New Mexico, the evolution of this gun issue. Last session, which was the first kind of under the aegis of what I call the true progressives, 2019 session, where guns were in the sights of a lot of people who wanted to reduce access to them. Do you see? I assume you see this as something that's going to happen again in 2020. So talk a little bit about what happened in 2019, and then where you see the 30-day session coming up for New Mexico in terms of gun rights.
So 2019 was a fast and furious legislative session. There were about 20 anti-gun bills going through the legislature. There were some bills that were mirror images of each other, starting in the House and in the Senate. Things started off with our first hearing was on 6 different bills in the House, where I think we had about 500 people show up to testify against them. The opposition outnumbered any support, but the bills were still voted through to the House floor. The Senate was a little bit slower to get going, and as kind of bills progressed, a lot of them, we did defeat quite a bit of them through some very useful testimony from constituents that really makes a huge difference to legislators. We had some great testimony, and people took time out of their schedules to come out, including the Sheriff's Association. So as we got, more into February and the end of session, which happened in March, I think legislators were a little bit more hesitant to vote for some of this stuff. By that time, background checks had passed, and the domestic violence bill was on its way, but everything else was defeated. So even though there were some things that passed, the people of New Mexico did put up an amazing fight and in turn defeated a lot of the legislation. One of those bills being the red flag bill, which we anticipate is going to come back in 2020. That's probably one of the most serious ones that not only impacts Second Amendment rights, but due process rights. Probably due process more so than anything else. So it's really something that not just Second Amendment supporters should care about, but anybody that believes in the basis of our Constitution and how fundamental rights are taken away. So can
you remind us what exactly did pass and was signed by the governor in 2019?
Yes. So universal background checks was passed and signed by the governor. And domestic violence, anybody convicted of a domestic violence crime would have their Second Amendment rights taken away. The thing with the domestic violence bill, that's already a federal law, so we're not sure why we needed a state companion to that. So it's already illegal. And the background checks bill was just poorly written. To the point of where it could potentially include a transfer of a firearm for something as, for a promise or for other consideration. It wasn't specific as to just a sale. So there's a lot of concern that the language of that bill will have a lot of unintended consequences for things like, classes that people give for shooting and youth competitions and things like that. But those were the two that passed.
Okay. And talk about the problems with the red flag bill and any other bills that you see being seriously considered in the 2020 session. Of course, this being a 30-day session starting in mid-January and running clock going through February. So it's a very tight. You thought last session was fast and furious. If they try to cram everything that they seem to want to cram into these sessions, this 30-day session is going to be equally busy.
Right. So this is technically supposed to be a budget session. So anything having to do with budget issues should be on the call. However, the governor could put anything she would like on that call. I think the two things that we are fairly certain are coming is the red flag bill, and the other one is safe storage, which would require individuals to store their firearms in a certain way when they're inside their home. The red flag bill being the more serious one because it's probably about a 20-page bill that establishes a totally new process in New Mexico for confiscation of firearms. I don't know if I'm sure Zach probably mentioned this, but it basically takes away your rights without a hearing in front of a judge first. And we have some serious issues with that. Even the ACLU in Rhode Island wrote a 14-page opposition paper on the concept of red flag laws. You're essentially punishing somebody just not because they've committed a crime, but because you think at some point they may commit a crime. So there's already statutes on the books now in New Mexico that allow law enforcement to take an individual in if they feel like they're a threat to themselves or others. So we're not sure why this bill is needed. Those are the two that we feel are going to have a very good chance of making it onto the call by the governor. The other ones that there has been rumor of is a high-capacity magazine ban and potentially a semi-automatic ban. I've seen drafts of those. I don't know if they're going to make it onto the actual calendar or not, but those are out there also.
All right. Well, thanks for the update on what's happening in Santa Fe. I appreciate your time with us, Alexandra. We will see you in Santa Fe, I'm sure, during the 30-day session, and a lot to look at and keep track of. So good luck with tracking all these various pieces of legislation and dealing with the progressive streak of folks up in Santa Fe.
Yep. And we usually, Zach, through the association, will send out alerts. So anybody that wants to participate, know what's going on. We will have updated information daily during session so you guys can keep track if that's something you're interested in. Head to the NMSSA website and we'll keep you posted.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Zach, we're going to continue our conversation here, getting back down to the local level here in Albuquerque, because it's not just Santa Fe. And of course, we talked about the shift here in New Mexico with increasing emphasis on urban issues and representation and policy making. City of Albuquerque has jumped in now to the gun law making business. So can you give a brief overview for folks about what's coming down the pike and when you see it coming down the pike here in the city of Albuquerque?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for bringing that up. So as you said, Mayor Tim Keller and the progressive city councilors have taken it upon themselves to attempt to regulate firearms through the city of Albuquerque. And what's really important and what we need to get this conversation grounded on is there is a preemption clause in the state constitution of New Mexico that says counties and municipalities cannot regulate an instance of the right to keep and bear arms. So that's what we have to keep in mind. And really quickly, actually, I want to kind of bring this into a little bit wider scope just for a moment, in that New Mexico is not the only state where they're trying to challenge a state preemption clause. In Montana, Pennsylvania, and Washington recently, those states also have state-level firearm law preemption clauses, and those have all been challenged and actually upheld recently. So there is now that's in each state individually, but so we're seeing a trend of people trying to challenge state level preemption clauses. So
just real quickly, kind of on a more philosophical level, it's not just the Rio Grande Foundation that believes this, but preemption is something that states have a complete right to do. Unfortunately, that was a negative for us when we pushed right to work at the local level, got 9 counties to adopt right to work laws, and the state then in 2019, Damon Eli, state representative who I know is involved in some of these legislative shenanigans on the bad side with regard to guns, but the state passed a preemption on right to work. While we disagree with that, they have every right to do that. On the flip side, now, of course, the progressives don't like state preemption when it comes to guns, and so they're trying to push the envelope, city council, Mayor Keller, et cetera.
Yeah, and actually, Damon Eli, he's the primary sponsor of the red flag bill, both in 2019, and he's going to reintroduce again in 2020. All right, so let's get down to kind of a little bit more granular detail on what's going on in the city of Albuquerque right now. So Mayor Tim Keller signed an executive order to reclassify City of Albuquerque community centers as schools. Now, the purpose of doing that is that you are not allowed to bring a firearm into a school. There are state and federal laws against doing that. However, community centers, historically have not been considered schools. If they're considered a school, you cannot bring a firearm. And if it's considered government property in New Mexico, you can bring a firearm in. Government property excluding schools, I should say. You can bring a firearm in. So you can bring a firearm into city council. You can bring a firearm into the roundhouse. Now, I discourage people from openly carrying firearms. I think it creates an unnecessary distraction. However, they have a right to do that. And I encourage people to exercise their rights with discretion. So what they're trying to do is basically challenge a preemption. I'll talk about the legislation. So Mayor Tim Keller is trying to change community centers to be considered schools. There is currently a lawsuit from Blair Dunn challenging that rule change, and it's currently working its way through court. The next thing I want to talk about is ordinances 082 and 083 from city councilors Pat Davis and Ike Benton, who are openly card-carrying members of kind of this progressive group in New Mexico. So the first one of these resolutions, what it would do is it creates a type of quote-unquote safe storage law. And I say quote-unquote safe storage law because in reality, what these laws basically are is I like to call them criminal protection acts, because it tells you what you can and cannot do with a firearm in your own home. A firearm is your lawfully owned, constitutionally protected property, and they want to tell you what you can and can't do with it in your own home. Other places that they've passed these laws, they found that there's no added safety benefit because most people store their firearms in a safe way already, and the people who do not store their safe firearms in a secure manner are the people who are apt to be ignoring these type of laws to begin with. There are people who don't own the firearms legally to begin with. And so if they don't own the firearm legally to begin with, why are they going to follow a law on the firearm storage? And this law is entirely unenforceable because unless you're going to go door to door saying, hey, can I see how you're storing your firearms? There's no way to enforce this. The only way you can...
Which Benton and Davis would no doubt love to do because they are purely evil, and I will say that on a podcast. And Isaac Benton is still in a runoff election here in December. So we won't see action out of the city probably until January of 2020, I expect, because of the dynamics of the runoff and then the holidays and all that stuff. And so we're talking January when they're doing this. Sorry to interrupt your...
No worries.
Yes, Pat Davis and Isaac Benton are evil.
So anyway, there's a criminal protection act is unenforceable unless you're going to go door to door. So the only time you could ever be enforced is, okay, so someone negligent leaves a firearm where a child can gain access to it or someone else can gain access to it. And then they use that and then if a child uses that firearm to injure themselves, you can already charge the owner of that firearm with child abuse because that's putting a child in a situation that endangers your life. You wouldn't put your child in the driver, you wouldn't put like your 10-year-old child in the driver's seat of your car when you're driving down the interstate and say, well, here you go. So putting a firearm that's loaded, I mean, it's a dangerous tool that should be treated with respect. And treating a firearm with respect does not mean leaving it where a child can gain access to it. So this is actually where kind of individual rights come in. We strongly believe that that the reasonable people will choose to store their firearms in a way that's best for them and keeps the firearm secure. We don't think you need to have a law to do this, and a law to do this isn't going to get the intended result. So this is kind of where the individual liberty aspect really ties into Second Amendment, because we believe that people will act reasonably in a way that benefits themselves the best. And this is kind of one of those big dividing lines between, the more progressive, dare I say, socialist mindset and a more liberty-minded mindset.
Totalitarianism, socialism, they're all kind of part of the same group of ideologies. So we have one that has been passed, that is, or not passed. It was a Keller executive order.
That was the Keller executive order.
Right.
That's with regards to the community centers being classified as schools, so you can't bring a firearm in.
Right.
There's the second ordinance, which is you cannot bring firearms into any city property, period.
Okay.
And this has been, because right now you can bring a firearm into City Hall.
Right.
I don't encourage people to openly carry firearms because I don't feel that is a good way to communicate the point you're trying to make. However, they have that right to do so. So on this, that's another one that's very...
Now, how about concealed carry? Because that gets into a lot of issues as well. So if you are in a city facility, and I believe this includes parks as well, which are not in anything generally, they're open space. But where does concealed carry come into all of this?
So what the city of Albuquerque is doing, they're trying on the bill to ban firearms from city property. It's both open carry and concealed carry. It's any type of carrying of firearms, whether it be open or concealed. They're not delineating between the two. So in New Mexico, we actually have a right to open carry a firearm, and you can actually, I've heard some legal arguments that would say we actually have a right guaranteed by the state constitution to open carry. Many people, you do see people around town open carrying. That's their right to do so. I don't, because I feel like it can make you a target for someone who has unsavory purposes. And particularly, if you're one person by yourself, there's a group of 3-4 criminals around you. They see that firearm, they want that firearm. You've now made yourself a target for those individuals. Particularly, if your back is turned to these people, you won't even know. So I generally, people have a right to concealed carry. I don't concealed carry. I say open carry. You have a right to open carry. I generally kind of shy away from that within populated areas. But the city of Albuquerque, they're not delineating between the two. It's just no firearms whatsoever on city property. And so this is running directly up against the state preemption clause. And I want to point out to your listeners that the state preemption clause has already been challenged and upheld in court in 2002 in Baca versus New Mexico Department of Public Safety. When passing, it was some amendments to the concealed carry laws. Basically, it was actually Mayor Jim Baca tried to challenge some of that on basically saying, with the city of Albuquerque wanted to do their own concealed carry regulations, and the state of New Mexico said, no, you cannot do that. So the state preemption clause for fire stating that counties and municipalities cannot regulate an instance of the right to keep and bear arms. It's already been challenged in court. It's been upheld in court. And we feel strongly that should the city of Albuquerque pass these resolutions that would run counter to the state preemption clause, that the city of Albuquerque is just wasting taxpayer dollars.
Well, it won't be the first time, nor will it be the last that they waste taxpayer dollars. But obviously, it's a bigger state beyond Albuquerque. There are arguably more liberal communities. Certainly Santa Fe traditionally has been considered more liberal, as has Las Cruces become a liberal bastion as well, which, that has its own challenges and whatnot. But have city governments or local governments outside of the city of Albuquerque been as aggressive? Are they pushing the envelope? What has that tenor been? Because, Santa Fe, of course, has notably always been a very left-wing city. You would think that they would be the ones pushing on these kinds of issues even more aggressively than Albuquerque.
So what we've seen from the city of Santa Fe, both from Mayor Weber and his predecessor, Mayor Gonzalez, I believe was his name. We see a lot of bark, but not a whole lot of bite yet, in the sense that they've talked about trying to pass some kind of city level regulations. However, I think it's the state preemption clause that's kept them at bay. One thing we do know, they seriously talked about drafting some legislation for an ammunition tax in the city of Santa Fe. However, they backed off from doing that. And part of that was, I think, some of the pressure that the shooting sports community was able to kind of leverage and say, taxing ammo is mostly just going to go after people who do a lot of target shooting, and those people are obviously not the problem here.
Yeah, an ammo tax. I mean, obviously, this is where you really get into the heart of some of these economic issues relating to gun rights as well. Targeting individual products, whether it's soda pop, as Santa Fe famously tried to do, and we were one of the groups that helped stop them from doing that, or ammunition. It's where they're using economic policies to achieve social ends of the hard left progressive movement. So it's a fascinating discussion. Now, how about Las Cruces? Anything down there?
So the city of Las Cruces, they attempted to pass what they did is a resolution where they actually wanted to call upon the state of New Mexico to pass a quote unquote assault weapons ban. What they mean by that is a semi-automatic rifle ban, and ban magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. What they did is they eventually watered down the resolution to support the criminalization of private firearm sales, also known as universal background checks. Really what it is criminalizing private firearm sales. So they passed a resolution calling upon the state to take action. The city of Albuquerque's passed several resolutions. They recently passed a resolution in support of the red flag on gun confiscation laws. I know the Santa Fe City Council has also passed resolutions, but that's mostly where they've operated, is passing non-binding resolutions because of this state preemption clause. And what we've seen in other states, because I actually want to tie back into the comment I made about other states challenging state-level preemption clauses, is we've actually seen gun control organizations actually funding lawyers to help these people go after this stuff. And, that's something where my organization is looking at in New Mexico to see are there some of these national gun control organizations trying to put some backing into this effort to challenge state level preemption clauses.
Well, Michael Bloomberg, who is now a presidential candidate, but also a very anti-gun individual, has, I believe, directly funded two people working for the state attorney general's office in New Mexico. I'm not sure.
He has. From my understanding, those lawyers, their background is in environmental law. And actually, when people bring up Michael Bloomberg, it's kind of this tragic irony to it. I mean, this country has afforded this man incredible freedom that he has been able to achieve a monumental amount of wealth that would have just been wealth and prosperity that was being unheard of even a short time ago. However, he's using this freedom that was granted to him to then turn around to try and take those similar freedoms away from other individuals. And I find that tragically ironic.
Well, he's certainly not alone. There are plenty of them just in the Democratic presidential nomination process alone. But of course, there's still a lot, great things going on in this country, in this state. So just to clarify, we talked about Santa Fe, Las Cruces, Albuquerque. Are there any other local governments that have been particularly egregiously bad on the gun issue? Because I want to talk about some of the good things going on at the local level.
Actually, a lot of the other local governments have taken action was actually during this past legislative session when you had the sanctuary county for the Second Amendment push. There were a lot of towns and municipalities that passed it. I actually want to point out that Espanola, New Mexico, declared itself as a sanctuary for the Second Amendment. That's amazing. A very heavily Democrat town. And so when you go up to those regions, that's where he talked about, there is a real urban-rural divide in the Democratic Party on this stuff. A lot of the sheriffs who support our Second Amendment rights are Democrats. A lot of the county commissioners who voted for Second Amendment sanctuary county resolutions are Democrats. A lot of the city councilors in places like Espanola, it wasn't Republicans voting this in to get this passed in Espanola. It was Democrats voting for this. So there still are some good Democrats in this state. And, I think as liberty-minded individuals, we need to be reaching out to these people and saying, we have some common ground here for some bipartisan action. Because I believe that there is a bipartisan majority of Second Amendment supporters in New Mexico. It's just that with the amount of money that Democrats bring in from people like Michael Bloomberg, the way they kind of everything, if you look at the leadership in the House and the Senate for the Democrats, it's basically exclusively Albuquerque, Las Cruces, Santa Fe. They've just kind of leveraged these progressive kind of leveragers position and the governor. They've leveraged their position with all this money to take over. When I think if you really view it in terms of bipartisan support, there is a bipartisan Second Amendment majority in this state.
So let's talk a little bit more, because that's exactly what I was going to get to was the sheriffs and people who have stood up. Now, it's real quick, worth discussing the unique role of sheriffs relative to other political elected officials in our state. Would you like to explain why they're kind of unique relative to maybe a city councilor or even a mayor?
Yeah, so a sheriff, from my understanding, is effectively the highest elected official in a county. I mean, they're kind of the ultimate authority in a county. And so they have a wide-ranging jurisdiction. It's been found that you cannot compel someone to enforce a law. So these sheriffs can basically say, you know what, to begin with, the law that we were mostly talking about was universal background checks. No one's enforcing this law. It's unenforceable. It doesn't matter if you say you're going to enforce it or not. These laws, in Colorado, after it was passed, the only time it was enforced is basically tacking on charges on somebody else who stole a firearm. And that's one thing we're going to be looking at here pretty soon is, because Albuquerque, Las Cruces, and Santa Fe said they were going to enforce this law. We're going to find out pretty soon if they are. So the sheriffs have a unique role in this. And under the state constitution, they're the highest official in the county, and there have been court precedent that found that they have some leeway on that.
Yeah, and if the attorney general says jump, the sheriff can tell him to jump right back, or whatever they want to tell the attorney.
The sheriffs are found, or their positions are funded through the counties. So it's not like this, they can say, oh, we're going to cut your funding. The sheriffs are funded through the counties. And actually, you bring up that letter from the Attorney General Hector Balderas. There's actually, if you read through that letter, his letter was not addressing the law that was passed in New Mexico. It was addressing the law that was passed in Washington. I think that letter was more or less copied and pasted from a letter that was written by the Washington Attorney General, because in his letter to the New Mexico sheriffs, the Attorney General of New Mexico said, you have to perform these background checks. There's nothing in that bill that talks about sheriffs and law enforcement performing background checks. However, the law in Washington was talking about semi-automatic rifles. They had to perform background checks. So if you actually read the letter from the Attorney General to the sheriffs, he does not address the law that was passed in New Mexico.
And just all circles back to the genius of the founding fathers and the people who created our government structures over 200 years ago, in the way that they are fractured and split for a reason. And it's because we don't want the Pat Davises and the Isaac Bentons of this world to have unilateral control. That's how you have China and Soviet Union and real tragedies, and having sheriffs there is another bulwark, along with state, federal constitutions and the Electoral College. I mean, you go down the road, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, all these things. We can be very grateful for the founding fathers having that foresight, and hopefully, are you working with the sheriffs? Are you strategizing? Is your organization, or how is that process working? Because these are law enforcement officials. I'm sure they get together, but they might not have the 50,000-foot strategic view that folks at the NRA or the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association have. How are you preparing for the next onslaught of anti-gun legislation, especially at the state level?
We talk a lot with the sheriffs, but you know what? Our sheriffs, they take a leadership role in a lot of different things. You can't tell our sheriff's association, people outside the sheriff's association can't tell the sheriff's association what to do. They are a group of experienced bipartisan law enforcement officers, and actually, since we're recording this on Veterans Day, many of them are veterans. They've put their lives on the line for this country, and so no one outside the NRA doesn't tell the Sheriff's Association what to do. the Sheriff's Association decides that this is what they want to do, because they're the ones on the ground enforcing laws. And actually on the red flag law, because it is a civil order, it is the jurisdiction of the sheriffs, not your local PD, to actually go confiscate those firearms. So these sheriffs, they have a real vested interest in this red flag bill, because it's going to be them and their deputies who have to go to people's doors to take away their firearms under the red flag bill that Damon Eli is proposing. But we talked to the sheriffs. Recently, we had a legislative town hall here for my organization, Mexico Shooting Sports Association. We had several state representatives there. We also had one of the sheriffs there to talk to us about, how the sheriffs see things, what the sheriffs are hearing, because, they had the governor created a committee, so to speak, of sheriffs and legislators to try and work on a red flag bill. And basically, from my understanding, from talking to the sheriffs, what went down was Damon Eli said, "I'm not moving on this. You guys need to move." And they said, "Well, we're not moving either." So no compromise was reached. And then actually I have been told by the sheriffs that final meeting that they had, when Damon Eli said he was disappointed that the sheriffs didn't show up, the sheriffs were not invited to that meeting. So, we talked to the sheriffs. We're on the same page as the sheriffs. The sheriffs have been some phenomenal supporters, both locally and nationally. Some of the sheriffs have gotten some national attention for how strongly they support our Second Amendment rights. But nobody tells a sheriff's association what to do except for the sheriff's association.
No, that's great, and that's the way you want it. Of course, there also are strategic considerations and ideas. You want to bounce off each other, media approaches. So, rate it for us, or not rate it for us. Give us a status report. There's 33 counties in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. An overwhelming majority of sheriffs, as I recall, had joined together to essentially fight back against that. Give me the nuts and bolts. How were they specifically fighting back? What did they specifically do to ensure that people have their gun rights in these counties? And what about the people in the other counties that aren't among that coalition?
So, yeah, like you said, there's 33 counties in New Mexico. So 29 out of 33 sheriffs signed a letter opposing every gun control measure introduced this past legislative session.
So 4 did not.
4 did not. Of those 4, Bernalillo County Sheriff Mandy Gonzalez was one of the 4 who did not sign the letter from the Sheriff's Association. However, he did release his own individual statement opposing many of the measures and saying he supports our Second Amendment rights. So while he did not elect to sign the letter from the other 29 sheriffs, he still put out a statement in support of our Second Amendment rights.
So there's 3 other counties there?
So there's 3 other counties there. It is Doña County, Santa Fe County, and Los Alamos County.
No surprise in any of those. Just liberal sheriffs or the political zeitgeist of those areas. And I want to talk about, praise the other 29, but we got to talk about the black sheep around New Mexico and who's not signing on or supporting.
So the only sheriff, actually only one of them ever spoke in favor of the gun control laws, and that's Sheriff Kim Stewart from Doña County. She is the only sheriff who actually came up to speak out in favor of gun control. The other 2 sheriffs who did not elect to come out in support of the Second Amendment, the Santa Fe County Sheriff and the Los Alamos County Sheriff, they basically took a silent approach to the matter, where they didn't issue statements for or against. And especially in the political climate in Santa Fe, I can actually respect that the sheriff there, he said, this is not something I'm going to get involved in.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Kim Stewart and Doña County. Is that a man or a woman?
It's a woman.
Okay. There's some men out there with the name Kim, so I just wanted to be clear on that. So the 29 who did sign and kind of describe the tenor of this letter, obviously it's, I'm sure, too long to discuss in detail, but what was the concept behind the letter?
The concept behind the letter was these laws that are being passed, many of them are unenforceable, like the universal background checks or criminalization of private firearm sales. They're either unenforceable or like the red flag bill, they severely would take away our constitutional rights. Because when you're talking about the red flag bill, it's not just Second Amendment. This is about due process, because basically you're using a civil order to remove someone's lawfully owned, constitutionally protected rights. And being a civil order, you do not get to have a attorney present unless you can afford your own attorney. So you don't get to have an attorney present. The first time you're even aware that one of these orders was issued against you was when the police are at your door to take away your firearms. And then in kind of after all this process, once your firearms are taken away, an order has been issued for an entire year, you have to meet a higher legal standard to get your firearms back than your accuser had to meet to take your firearms away in the first place. And so we're talking about people who have not been convicted of a crime, could potentially be stripped of their constitutional rights for the rest of their lives if these orders are renewed indefinitely, and they would lose their constitutional rights without ever being convicted of a crime. And actually, if you go through the real minute language of that red flag bill, it talked about, a law enforcement officer can apply for this. So it doesn't have to be someone It actually could be a government employee saying, we want to take this person's firearms away and we want to execute. And how small is a round of ammunition? They could search your entire house and do all that kind of stuff. So to take a step back from that, that was one of the sheriff's
sounds
biggest
a lot
concerns.
like civil asset forfeiture, by the way, which we worked on in 2015 and got a law passed in the legislature unanimously, signed by the governor, then Martinez, to eliminate that process.
Yeah. Okay. But so that was one of the things that really got the sheriffs worked up. So to kind of take you through a little bit of the timeline. So they come out with this letter as we're going into the session. They know this stuff is coming. They say, instead of doing that, we need to get real serious in this state about when someone commits a crime, convicting them and putting them behind bars. That's not something we do in this state, unfortunately. So that was kind of the first thing that came out was this letter. So then the sheriffs go up to Santa Fe for the first day of the legislative session, and they're told, these are sheriffs, sworn law enforcement officers, that the sheriffs are not allowed to bring their firearms into the roundhouse.
Right. I remember that. And then they were subsequently allowed to.
They were allowed to, but there had to be some kind of order from the state police and the people running the roundhouse that the sheriffs, who were sworn law enforcement officers, were not allowed to bring their firearms into the roundhouse. So that happened. The sheriffs, they basically started to ram this gun control through committee. There was actually a bill that passed committee that would have required Home Depot to run federal background checks on people who wanted to buy a nail gun because they attempted to redefine the definition of a firearm.
Wow. Well, we could talk for a long time, but folks, if you want to get involved in or find out more about Zach's group, the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association, go to nmssa.org, and you can also find them at 417, that's area code 505-417-9310. So, Zach Fort, thanks for being on Tipping Point, New Mexico. And thank you, listeners, for tuning into this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point, New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.